During one of the winter campaigns of the Second World War, the Eastern Front consisted not of a continuous line, but of scattered strongpoints separated by stretches of open terrain. One of these positions was located on a nameless height near a destroyed village. A German infantry battalion had been ordered to hold this ground because it controlled a route needed for supplying nearby units. The battalion had occupied the height for several weeks. Soldiers dug positions into the frozen earth, reinforced them with logs, set up communication trenches, and placed machine gun and mortar posts where the terrain allowed. The flanks were covered only by a thin forest belt, and the ground in front was cut by ravines and low shrubs, leaving the defensive line exposed to sudden movement. Although winter reduced the scale of active fighting, artillery strikes and reconnaissance probes continued. Reports brought to battalion command offered conflicting information about a possible enemy buildup. Higher headquarters believed the main assault would come from another sector. Local reconnaissance, however, noted new firing points, vehicle movement at night, and changes in radio activity. Observation posts were placed across the position. Each had its own signaling tools. Flares of different colors indicated specific instructions for artillery. A strict table described which color requested fire, which marked own positions, and which identified target directions. Any mistake could have serious consequences. On the evening before the key events, the situation seemed tense but routine. Frost intensified, and the clear sky improved visibility, while also making troops more noticeable on the snow. The air carried sound far across the terrain. Under these conditions, any light or movement attracted attention. The battalion staff checked observation posts, supplies of flares, and communication lines with artillery batteries in the rear. Some flares were past their expiration date, but shortages made it difficult to replace them. Inspections were recorded, yet in practice, many old items remained in use. Late at night, one observation post, manned by a small group, noticed faint shapes moving across the snowfields. At first, the shapes looked like shadows, but soon it became clear that enemy groups were advancing through ravines toward a weak point between companies. The observers tried to report the movement by telephone, but the line failed due to earlier damage. According to instructions, if contact with command was lost, the observer had to act independently. Several flare types were stored nearby, each marked by color. In the dark and cold, the markings were difficult to read, and some old flares had faded labels. The observer believed he had selected the correct flare to request defensive fire on the front line. He loaded the signal pistol and fired into the night. The flare rose sharply and burned bright in the sky. But the color was not the one intended for close defensive fire. Instead, it corresponded to a request for artillery to strike deeper in the enemy rear. Under normal circumstances, this error could have caused severe damage to friendly positions. The flare signaled the wrong target zone, and artillery crews, acting according to established doctrine, would prepare a different fire mission. However, the actual situation on the ground did not match the assumptions made in planning documents. Several simultaneous factors were unfolding that would transform this mistake into an unexpected turning point. The flare launched by the observer rose into the cold night sky and illuminated the terrain with a color that did not match the intended meaning. Instead of signaling for immediate defensive fire along the battalion's forward line, it indicated the need to strike enemy forces located deeper beyond the visible horizon. Under normal conditions, this would have caused artillery batteries to ignore the immediate threat and adjust their mission to a more distant target. The mistake could have opened a dangerous gap in the battalion's defense at the very moment enemy troops were preparing to advance. However, events that night did not follow the expected sequence. The artillery batteries supporting the battalion had been operating under difficult conditions for several days. Their supply lines were strained, and many fire missions had been postponed due to shortages of ammunition. Battery commanders relied heavily on signals that confirmed enemy concentrations in specific areas. When the wrong-colored flare appeared, They interpreted it as a sign that the enemy was preparing staging points farther to the rear. This interpretation aligned unexpectedly with intelligence gathered earlier in the day, which mentioned increased movement behind enemy lines. As a result, the artillery officers concluded that the flare validated their expectations. Because of this, the artillery batteries reacted more quickly than they would have during a typical defensive fire request. They prepared to engage what they believed to be a deeper and more substantial target. The guns fired several coordinated salvos toward a sector that was rarely struck. The shells started to fall along a line of approach routes used by the enemy to move reserves and reinforcements toward the front. At almost the same time, the enemy troops advancing toward the gap in the battalion's line were moving in a pattern that partially overlapped with the newly designated target zone. The attackers had chosen to gather in low ground just beyond a series of small ridges. Their commanders believed this area to be safely out of sight from German observation. But due to the winter landscape and the frozen soil, sound and light behaved unpredictably. The flare's glow made the enemy silhouette briefly visible from the artillery observers' positions further in the rear, reinforcing the impression that the signal had identified a distant concentration of troops. The first artillery salvos landed unexpectedly close to the advancing units. They were not prepared for a bombardment in that particular sector. Their formations, still reorganizing after crossing several ravines, became disordered. Some units tried to retreat into the low ground, while others moved sideways to find cover among small clusters of trees and rocks. The confusion significantly delayed their coordinated attack. Simultaneously, within the battalion's defensive line, officers watched the explosions in the distance with uncertainty. They suspected a misfire, but they also noticed that enemy movement had slowed. The artillery bombardment created a series of shockwaves that disrupted the attackers' ability to move forward according to their plan. The impact of the shells also triggered small avalanches of snow along the slopes, making the terrain temporarily difficult to traverse. As the bombardment continued, German reconnaissance elements located further back detected new signs of enemy movement in the illuminated areas. Their reports, sent through more reliable communication lines, reached battalion command. Combining these messages with the observed explosions persuaded the battalion commander that the flare, although seemingly incorrect, might have been used in response to a larger threat hidden from the forward observation posts. This interpretation, though inaccurate, aligned with the command's existing fear of a deeper enemy push. Based on this assumption, the battalion ordered its reserves to shift toward the sector that seemed to be under threat. These reserves consisted of a handful of machine gun teams and a small group of riflemen who had been kept behind the main line for emergencies. Their redeployment strengthened the area that the enemy had initially intended to exploit. Meanwhile, the artillery bombardment continued to spread across the low ground, gradually intensifying the confusion among enemy troops. What was planned as a stealthy and concentrated assault turned into a scattered and disorganized advance. Units lost contact with each other. Officers struggled to maintain communication, and the cold winter terrain amplified the effects of the explosions by carrying sound deep into the valleys. In the defensive line, the soldiers who had witnessed the flare launch did not realize that their battalion's survival might depend on the chain of misunderstandings unfolding beyond their sight. The forward observation post remained unaware of the exact consequences of the mistake. They saw only distant flashes and heard muffled detonations. Yet each explosion further disrupted the attackers' coordination. By the time enemy troops attempted to resume their advance, the artillery barrage had forced them to alter their route. Instead of moving through the weak gap between the companies, they shifted toward a more fortified position. This new direction required crossing open ground, where they became more vulnerable. When they finally emerged from the ravines, they entered a field of fire covered by German machine gun crews who had just repositioned from the reserve. A planned surprise attack had now become a fragmented and ill-timed maneuver. The misinterpreted flare signal had initiated a chain reaction that none of the soldiers at the observation post could have foreseen. The battalion's chances of withstanding the assault increased significantly, although the defenders still did not understand why the enemy advance had slowed. What had started as a simple mistake was rapidly evolving into a moment that would later be described in war diaries as one of the most improbable turns of fortune during that winter campaign. The hours that followed the unexpected artillery strike brought a series of changes across the battalion's front that only later became fully understood. The enemy advance had been thrown into disarray, but the battalion command remained cautious. The winter night limited visibility, and the sound of distant explosions carried unevenly across the frozen terrain. No one at the forward positions could determine the full scale of the enemy's disruption. Within the battalion headquarters, officers analyzed reports arriving from different sectors. Some outposts mentioned brief movements followed by silence. Others noted unusual noise patterns that did not correspond to a coordinated assault. These fragmented observations suggested that the enemy attack had either been postponed or redirected, yet no one could confirm why. The artillery units, unaware of the confusion their fire had caused, maintained readiness to adjust their strike pattern. The flare had been interpreted as confirmation of earlier intelligence, so the batteries prepared additional salvos. Their commanders believed that they were preventing an enemy reinforcement effort in the depth of the hostile lines. The bombardment, therefore, continued at intervals, widening the zone of impact and further complicating the enemy's regrouping attempts. Meanwhile, the infantry battalion, now reinforced by its small reserve force, strengthened its defenses in the sector believed to be under increased threat. Machine gun teams repositioned themselves behind improvised snow embankments, linking arcs of fire. Rifle squads adjusted their fields of observation, marking distances and identifying likely approach routes. Despite the biting cold, these preparations gave the defenders a sense of structure. In the ravines where the enemy forces had gathered earlier, the bombardment created a series of obstacles. Snowdrifts collapsed under the pressure waves, and debris from small trees blocked narrow passages. The attacking companies were forced to split into smaller groups to navigate the altered landscape. Their commanders struggled to re-establish control because the pre-arranged communication signals were difficult to use in the shifting terrain. As dawn approached, the sky began to lighten with a faint gray glow. This change in light made the enemy's positions more visible from the German line. Patrols using field glasses observed scattered figures moving in inconsistent directions. The attackers appeared to have lost the element of coordination that their plan had required. At several points along the front, German observers noticed abandoned equipment. In some snowy depressions, dark shapes lay motionless, indicating casualties from the overnight shelling. The psychological effect of the bombardment had compounded the physical damage. Units that were meant to advance together found themselves isolated from each other. Battalion command began receiving clearer messages from reconnaissance elements stationed deeper in the rear. These reports indicated that enemy forces had clustered unexpectedly in zones far from the original axis of approach. This conclusion aligned with what had been observed from the forward line. A misdirected artillery strike had forced the enemy away from their intended breakthrough point and into areas where natural cover offered less protection. While the defenders still lacked complete understanding of the events, they adapted their strategy. Officers redistributed ammunition, strengthened fallback positions, and readied their radios in case further movement occurred. The men at the observation post who had launched the flare remained unaware that their action had influenced these developments. To them, the silence that now settled over the battlefield simply indicated another pause in winter fighting. However, silence did not mean safety. The enemy, having reorganized, made several small attempts to probe the battalion's line later in the morning. These movements were cautious and lacked the momentum of a planned assault. They were quickly detected by the now alert machine gun crews. Short bursts of fire discouraged the attempts and forced the enemy to retreat toward the ravines. By midday, the battalion command assessed the situation as stabilized. No immediate threat of breakthrough remained. The defensive preparations had been reinforced at the right moment, and the unexpected artillery fire had shaped the battlefield in their favor. Yet no one claimed credit for this shift, because none of the officers understood the origin of the incorrect flare. The incident was noted in the battalion log, with a simple remark about unusual artillery activity. In the increasing daylight, patrols cautiously advanced a short distance beyond the forward line to assess the night's effects. They found deep shell craters, broken equipment, and traces of hurried movement. Tracks in the snow revealed that enemy units had attempted multiple changes in direction. The pattern suggested that their assault plan had collapsed shortly after beginning. When the patrols returned with their findings, Battalion Command finally recognized the magnitude of what had taken place. An enemy battalion strength formation had begun a coordinated night attack, but due to the unexpected artillery fire, it never reached the intended breach point. Instead, it encountered disorientation, fragmentation, and mounting casualties before withdrawing to reorganize. The significance of this outcome was clear. Without the artillery strike at that exact moment, the defenders would have faced an assault against a vulnerable gap in their line. The reserves might not have arrived quickly enough, and the position could have been lost. Much of this had been prevented by a single flare fired under the wrong assumption. Still, the battalion officers hesitated to attribute the fortunate result to coincidence. In wartime, outcomes were often influenced by overlooked details. Yet none could deny that the event marked an improbable turning point in the night's engagement. What had begun as a simple error was now recognized as a factor that had shaped the course of the battle. In the days that followed the disrupted enemy attack, the battalion slowly returned to its routine defensive posture. The winter landscape remained unchanged, but the atmosphere along the front shifted noticeably. The soldiers no longer expected an immediate offensive, and reports from reconnaissance teams confirmed that the enemy had pulled significant portions of its units farther back to regroup. Although occasional artillery exchanges continued, the threat of a concentrated breakthrough appeared to have diminished. Battalion Command compiled a detailed account of the night engagement. Officers reviewed notes from observation posts, radio logs, and sketches made by patrols sent out after the fighting subsided. The document showed an unusual pattern of enemy movement, marked by erratic changes in direction and gaps where units had failed to advance in coordination. The artillery impact areas, mapped by forward observers, revealed that the bombardment had struck precisely the routes used by the enemy to approach the front line. This analysis gradually led officers to the same conclusion. The barrage, triggered by a flare that had not been intended for that purpose, had effectively dismantled the structure of the enemy assault before it reached the battalion's positions. The mistake had produced an effect no planned action could have guaranteed under the circumstances. As the headquarters reviewed the sequence of events, attention naturally turned to the observation post that had launched the flare. The report from that position described loss of communication, limited visibility, increasing noise from advancing troops, and reliance on outdated signal munitions with unclear markings. The observer had acted according to protocol once communication failed, and his decision was categorized as an understandable misjudgment. Nothing in the report suggested that the observer understood the broader impact of his action. In an internal evaluation, Battalion Command acknowledged that the situation might have been far more dangerous if the flare had been fired correctly. A defensive fire mission aimed at the front line would have missed the place where the enemy had concentrated its forces before the attack. The enemy would have maintained cohesion and might have reached the vulnerable gap between sectors. Instead, artillery fire directed deeper disrupted the staging areas, scattered units, and delayed the attack long enough for the defenders to reinforce their positions. The event was documented as an example of how battlefield conditions often diverged from planned expectations. Commanders noted that rigid interpretations of signal procedures could sometimes work against operational needs, especially when terrain, weather, and enemy movement created unpredictable conditions. The analysis recommended a review of signal protocols and emphasized the importance of maintaining clear markings on signal munitions to avoid similar incidents in the future. Meanwhile, soldiers of the battalion shared simplified versions of the event. Many attributed the failed enemy attack to good fortune, while others saw it as an example of how small and seemingly insignificant actions could influence larger outcomes. The men at the observation post spoke little of the incident, focusing instead on routine tasks. Their position remained exposed to the harsh winter conditions, and attention quickly returned to maintenance of trenches, repair of equipment, and preservation of supply lines. The artillery units also conducted their own review. They noted that the incorrect flare color had matched previous intelligence reports, and that atmospheric conditions had made the flare unusually bright. The combination of these factors had caused them to adjust fire more rapidly than usual. Their logs described the event as an instance where pre-existing expectations aligned with an unexpected signal to produce an effective result. Over time, higher headquarters received a consolidated report on the engagement. The document highlighted the unusual nature of the outcome and stressed that no single action had been the decisive factor. Instead, the chain of events had depended on a combination of environmental conditions, miscommunication, and timing. Nevertheless, the conclusion stated clearly that the battalion had likely avoided a significant setback due to the artillery fire initiated by the misinterpreted signal. Although the observer who fired the flare was not singled out for commendation, his action was quietly acknowledged within the battalion as having played an important role. The incident became part of unit history, referenced occasionally by officers discussing the unpredictability of combat. It was recorded in the battalion diary as an example of how chance and circumstance could alter the course of an engagement. As winter continued, the battalion faced new challenges. Supply shortages, harsh weather, and sporadic attacks remained constant features of the front. Yet the soldiers carried with them an awareness that their survival in one of the most critical nights of the campaign had depended on a moment of human error that intersected with a series of unexpected battlefield conditions. Years later, when historians examined operational records from the period, the event resurfaced as an unusual case study. Analysts noted that the mistake had produced a tactical advantage that would have been difficult to achieve through deliberate planning. War, they observed, was often shaped not only by strategy and discipline, but also by the unpredictable interplay of small decisions made under pressure. The misfired flare, launched by cold hands in a dark trench, had altered the trajectory of a battalion facing overwhelming danger. What appeared to be a simple error became a decisive factor in preventing a breakthrough. For the men who held the position on that winter night, the outcome served as a reminder that in war, events could turn on details so minor that they were often overlooked until long after the danger had passed.